What's happening, folks? We are officially in the home stretch here. We have chapter 11, chapter 12 left in the material we need to cover, so let's get going. Chapter 11 is on mobilizing the ecological society. So the author talks about three foundations of ecological mobilization. He refers to them as cons. The interesting thing is that when we think of cons, we usually think of bads. But in this case, he uses it to map out three positive things that are imperative for ecological mobilization. The first is conceptions, or the creation of an ecological knowledge base. That knowledge base is then used to strengthen community ties or connections. And then that knowledge base embedded in these connections ultimately can lead to contestations or a political strategy. And in order for an effective ecological mobilization, you're going to need all three of these. First is conceptions. Of course, the most common approach to creating conceptions is education. There's hardly an environmental organization, whether it's governmental or non-governmental, which does not put a significant amount of emphasis on education. Educating the population to engage in a behavioral change. Nonetheless, after decades of environmental education, we still have environmental problems. And this continues to confound us because it seems like you have an environmental movement, and then about 30, 35 years later, we find ourselves in the same place. So education doesn't always lead to behavioral change. This leads to the critique of the behaviorist approach. This idea that if we change an individual's attitudes, that their behaviors will change as well is a bit naive. It doesn't take into consideration the patterns of economies, technology, what the built environment requires, and how these ideologies present tremendous obstacles to getting something changed when you try to act on your own. And in the end, people often resist this implied sense of guilt for doing something wrong by resisting knowledge. So when these behaviors don't change, and then we fault those individuals for not changing, their response is to entrench themselves in the problematic behaviors even more. This leads us to an idea called situational knowledge, or this need to understand the social context by which and in which people find themselves motivated to take action. Knowledge and awareness is a social matter. It's not a mechanical matter. If you want to change the world, a piece of technology by itself is not going to do. What you really need is the individuals that are using the technology, the individuals that are benefiting from the technology, to get on board as well. And then you maybe can see some significant change. As we've seen earlier, knowledge is an extremely important component of this particular debate. No person has all the knowledge. No person can pay attention to all the sources. And even if they did, not all the sources agree. So this is where we start getting into the social aspects of the knowledge creation, because each of us has to trust someone else who knows more about some aspect of something than we can determine on our own. And it's education, which is fundamentally about trust and social relations, in which we can gain a sense of what knowledge to pay attention to and what knowledge to disregard. That's really what education is there for us to do. It's to help us determine what is the relevant knowledge and what's the irrelevant knowledge, and giving us some ideas on how to differentiate between the two. It's important how we cultivate that knowledge. So what we take to be knowledge is a matter of one's identity and a matter of the social relations of trust that shapes one's identity and comes from one's identity. It's interactive, it's ongoing, and it's cultivated within a cultural context. And when you do this, when you're cultivating knowledge, you're also cultivating a sense of what we might call the ignorable. What I decide to focus on, and then what I choose to screen out. Coming back to this idea of what is whether ignorance is bliss or is it oblivion. To those that it is bliss, they appreciate that they have screened out a lot of stuff that doesn't force them to come to some new understandings of their realities. For those that it is oblivion, they've accepted it and it's no longer ignorable. They also talk about cultivating this dialogic consciousness. This means that central to knowledge cultivation is not only the existence of social relations of knowledge, but as well the character of those relations. They talk about frame analysis. Frame analysis in the past has been this top-down methods of knowledge cultivation, where the frame alignment, or the process by which an individual's frames become congruent or complementary with knowledge cultivation, is defined by some important concepts. One, frame bridging, frame amplification, frame extensions, and of course frame transformations. The effort is ultimately linked to knowledge and social relations and often reshapes them. Another important concept is conscientization, or building of critical consciousness in dialogue with the world. You have to remember that this does not emphasize persuasion. Rather, it develops people's critical capacities and welcomes differences and disagreements. One of the things that we've been running away from for a good long time is conflict. And it's within conflict of differences based on these critical capacities where we can find new paths forward. We have to get comfortable with the conflict. We just can't let it polarize us as it has today. This brings us to Hardin. Garrett Hardin and the tragedy of the commons. This is an important concept in environmental sciences, environmental sociology. Garrett Hardin came up with the tragedy of the commons to explain how the commons could be managed. He believed there were two choices. There was privatization or government run. And he believed that both led to overuse of the commons and ultimately a tragedy of its destruction. He used a herder example where each person tries to maximize the personal benefit of a common pool resource, i.e. a pasture, at the expense of everyone else. It's rationally logic for an individual to keep putting sheep on a common pasture, even though they know that ultimately it's going to result in the destruction of that common property. In the end, this leads to common pool resources that are ruined, and ultimately everyone loses. This is known as the problem of collective action, and in a world of self-interested actors, the real question comes to how do we get people to cooperate for their own benefit? This is something that Hardin pretty much assumes is not going to happen. But truth be told, there's plenty of examples in the commons where people do come and engage in collective action and surpass or solve the tragedy of the commons. As a matter of fact, the tragedy of the commons should probably be characterized as the tragedy of individualism, or a problem that stems from the inability of individuals to take a view wider than their own narrowly conceived self-interests. Hardin relies on rational choice to view human motivation, but we know that human choice is more than rational choice. It's actually embedded in sentiments as well. And this, of course, leads us to the dialogue of solidarities. What we want to understand is that based on the interaction between two mutually supporting bases of social commitment, a solidarity of interest, i.e. what benefits me, and a solidarity of sentiments, i.e. what benefits everyone else. These interests do not need to be the same, but they need to be complementary. And if this is going to work, trust is the critical element that it hinges upon. What we've seen is constant and mutually constituting interaction between the realm of the material, i.e. a solidarity of interests, and the realm of the ideal, or a solidarity of sentiments. If we can get these two right, then we can create good collective action that results in the sustaining use of common pool resources.